everyone to check those things out. But to be mindful of everyone's time, I would like to turn things over to my colleagues who are doing the Department Action Team work. So Gina, Joelle, Courtney, and Sarah, take it over.
Thanks, Alexis. We'll just get started with some quick introductions of the panelists.
Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Nye, and I am currently a research scientist at Colorado State University in the Institute for Learning and Teaching. And for the DAT project, I have been both a facilitator of DATs and a researcher for the project.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Wise. I'm from the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm on the research faculty at the Center for STEM Learning, and I've mainly been a facilitator on the DAT project and moving into some more research roles.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joelle Corbo. I'm a senior research associate in the Center for STEM Learning at CU Boulder, and I have played a bunch of hats on the DAT project, facilitator and researcher, and one of the PIs on our current grant that's funding the work.
Hi, folks. My name is Gina Kwan. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently an assistant professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at San Jose State University. But while on the DAT project, I was both a facilitator and a researcher on the DAT model.
So I'd like to go through a couple of technical things about how to participate today. We are using the Q&A feature on Zoom for you to ask questions of us panelists. You can find that at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A. Also, you can find answers to questions that were posted in the Q&A in the chat. So view that. And we have a poll coming up momentarily, so we'll enjoy seeing your answer to the poll. What we'll be doing today after the poll is going through an overview of the DAT model, followed by a review of some of the Q&A that come in on Zoom. And then we will talk about impacts that DATs have had at the University of Colorado Boulder and CSU. And then some recommendations for implementing the DAT model, including some information about new resources that we are providing. And then lastly, we have a section at the end also devoted to your Q&A.
And so just to start, we're going to do a little bit of audience participation. So for folks who have never used Slido before, it's an opportunity to interact with the webinar hosts. And so our prompt for you is, what types of change would you like to see in your department? And in order to answer this question, there's a link that Courtney will post in the chat to our Slido, and it will tell you how to answer that. Or if you are on a device where you can access a QR code, go ahead and open that with your phone or tablet. You can type in as many responses as you want, and it will form a word cloud for us to see. All right, I'm seeing some responses come in. Maybe we can just give like 30 more seconds for folks to answer. All right, I see a bunch of responses. We'll show the responses after Joel presents his slides, but go ahead, if you're still answering, you're welcome to keep doing that.
All right, so yeah, I'm want to talk through a little bit of just an overview of DATs and what they are. This is going to be pretty quick, and we're just going to sort of skim the surface. So if there's questions about any place you want us to go into more depth, feel free to use the Q&A feature for that, or the chat. But yeah, what is a DAT? So DAT stands for Departmental Action Team. A DAT is a departmentally based working group of, on average, something like 6 to 8 faculty members, staff members, and students from the same department that are working together with really two goals in mind, two big goals. One is to create some sort of change in their department around some broad scale undergraduate education issue with a real focus on changing departmental structures and culture. And we'll get to what sorts of projects or sort of issues DATs might work on later in the presentation. But for now, you can think of it as stuff like curricular alignment as opposed to like redesigning a course. Like that's kind of the idea of the scale. And the other big goal of a DAT is to support the participants in a DAT to become better change agents. So to become better at making change through developing their sort of facilitation and leadership skills and other skills. DATs first were developed at CU Boulder back in 2014, so they're about 6 years old now. The current NSF project that we're working with has been funded since 2016, and that extended our work to Colorado State University. So now, we've been running on 2 campuses. So in terms of like the characteristics of a DAT, like I said before, in terms of membership, there's about 6 to 8 people from a single department. We like to have diversity in roles. So ideally tenure track faculty and non-tenure track undergraduate students, graduate students, staff members of all sorts. Essentially, we really want anybody who's a stakeholder, who has a stake in undergraduate education in the department to be represented on the DAT. And we also want a diversity in demographics and other sorts of perspectives, like how long has somebody been in the department, basically as much of a cross-section as possible. The groups typically meet every other week for between 60 and 90 minutes and can run anywhere from, we've had DATs run anywhere from 2 to 4 semesters. Typically we start with the sort of agreement that we'll run for a year and see where it goes from there. And a lot of groups, most groups I would say, want to continue beyond that. So as I think everybody here has commented, we've all facilitated DATs at some point. So part of our model is having external facilitation. So facilitators who are not located in the department, but are external to it, which has a lot of benefits around, sort of being outside of the power structure and so on. And the fact that we've been deliberately trying to develop our facilitation skills. We've gone with the co-facilitation model. So typically we have 2 people facilitating any given DAT. Which also has a lot of benefits around sort of redundancy and being able to sort of model the kind of interpersonal behaviors that we'd like DAT members to take up. And we do a really explicit focus on process and team development. So what I mean by that is that we're not just there as sort of agenda setters and note takers, but we're also really explicitly talking about different ways that different sort of norms of communication that help groups function, different ways to think about how change works. So there's a lot of that kind of, we're not just focusing on the activities that the group is trying to achieve, but also these sort of meta skills around that. The issue that the DAT works on, or the area of focus, is chosen and or refined by the participants through a visioning process. We also feel that that's very important, that it not just be some external mandate that they're being told what to do, but that the group itself is developing that. And ideally, in terms of its relationship to the department, we want there to be a supportive chair, and we want there to be sort of regular communication between the DAT and the department to cultivate allies and build support and sort of just general positive feelings about the work of the group. And yeah, so on this slide, we've sort of sketched out in brief kind of what the life cycle of a DAT looks like. So how a DAT proceeds over time. So the starting point is maybe not obvious. We should label this better, but it's the top right circle that says assemble a diverse team. So that's really the starting point, is assembling the DAT team members. Then we move on, once we have the group, to developing a shared vision together of what it is that we want to achieve. From the vision emerges a set of consensus goals for the group to pursue. And then based on the goals, we define a specific project and figure out the work that it requires, which should ideally include some pieces of data collection and assessment, so that we know that the work is actually going as it's supposed to, or if it's not, so that one can adjust. Then we carry out the project work, assess and reflect on the results, and then move on to thinking about, well, what's the future of the DAT, which might involve rejiggering the team members, right? Because if you're talking about students, people graduate, some faculty might go on sabbatical, who knows, right? So we might have people come and go, or we might jump straight to coming to consensus on more goals. And this is, sort of linearizing a process that in practice is not linear, but this is just to really give you a sense of sort of how the group might proceed over time. And then on the next slide, we have our set of core principles for the project. So essentially, as it says on the bottom of the slide, this is a set of principles that we've developed really since the origins of the project. They've undergone a number of revisions. This is the current version. And these really serve as design principles, which is to say, when we're trying to make a decision about how should a DAT, decisions about sort of the structure of the model, or even like facilitation decisions sort of in the moment in a DAT, these are the sort of principles we go back to decide how it is that we should operate. They're also the sort of cultural characteristics that we'd like the DAT and the department to take up. And there's a lot of detail that one could go into with these principles. And fortunately, there is a paper that you can go check out, which is cited down at the bottom of the slide. But yeah, really these principles are all around things like, partnering with students, focusing on outcomes, data collection, positive collaboration, continuous improvement, and a grounding in equity, inclusion, and social justice. And then on the last slide of this section, I'm very briefly are sketching out a bit of our theory of change. So we have a pretty complex theory of change, or I would say extensive theory of change that describes how it is that, like what the outcomes of DATs that we're trying to achieve, and how logically we think that happens. In brief, though, it's divided into 3 sections. One that's all about the before the DAT forms, one that's about sort of when the DAT is running, and one that's after the DAT. Each of them have their own sort of outcomes that we're leading to in that stage. So in stage 1, the outcome is forming a DAT, so that one's pretty straightforward. In stage 2, we have 4 outcomes. That the department values the work of the DAT, that the DAT has affected change, that DAT members have become change agents, and that they can enact DAT culture without help. So you can sort of see how those are aligned with those 2 big goals that I talked about at the beginning, right? Creating change and making change agents. And then after we've formally stopped facilitation, we hope that the sort of work and influence of the DAT continues, and that ultimately leads to our big long-term outcome, which is that bullet at the bottom. The department is supported by its members in making sustainable, positive, iterative changes that are aligned with the core principles from the previous slide. But yeah, that's ultimately what we sort of as a project team are trying to achieve. Yeah, and that's it for now. So let's go into some Q&A, because that was a lot of information.
Yeah, so I see that there's been a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A. So one of the questions is this, or how is this connected to APS IDEA? And Joel, did you want to take that question?
Yeah, I can take that one up. Yeah, APS IDEA, started relatively recently. It's maybe about a year and change old, a year and a half old. And they have, the APS IDEA folks have started to take up some of, I think, the conceptual, the sort of concepts and pieces that we've built up on the DAT project. So there isn't really a formal relationship, but they have been using a lot of the ideas that have that we've been developing on the project. So, for example, I think that one of the things that they've had participants do is read at least excerpts from our core principles paper. And some of the folks who are some of the folks on this project are also in common with that project. So both Sarah and I are acting as facilitators over on the APS IDEA project. Anyone else want to add anything else?
I think that was great, Joel.
Okay.
So I see a question. How many facilitators are there? Yeah, I think we have to count them up.
I would say over the course of, since DAT started in 2014, I think we've had 9 people, I want to say, who have, actually 10, about 10 people who facilitated. And, that's also not like all at once. People have come, joined the project and left the project. So that's sort of cumulatively if you add everybody up.
And maybe I'll ask one more question during this little Q&A section, but we have another Q&A section also in the talk because someone asked, how would you incentivize, or sorry, no, a different question, sorry. How is this connected to the DALI initiative?
DALI, so that's another one where I'm also connected to that project. So the EP3 project, which is, I forget what EP3 stands for at this point, Effective Programs for Physics something. Anyway, the EP3 project is developing a guide to support effective physics programs. And as a part of that, we have this DALI initiative. So that's Department Action Leadership Institute. We are essentially trying to support departments in running their own DAT-like structures internally. So yeah, there's a pretty heavy overlap there because I'm also connected to that project.
Great, thanks. And then I think, Sarah, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the facilitator number question because I'm not sure exactly. There's another way to look at facilitators, and that is as co-facilitators of individual DATs. So typically in the DAT project, we've had 2 facilitators on the DAT staff that have facilitated from anywhere between a year and 2 years for each DAT as external facilitators. And another way to look at that is what happens after the external facilitation ends. And as I'll show you coming up on a new slide, about 60% of the DATs that we've run at CU and CSU have continued on with internal facilitation, meaning they've continued their group even though DAT staff are no longer active facilitators.
Great. So we'll move on, but go ahead and keep typing questions in the Q&A. We'll have another chunk of time dedicated to that. And the facilitator, some of the co-hosts will also be answering some of the questions in the chat. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts that DATs have been able to have.
So on this really large slide, we've attempted to consolidate all the different disciplines that DATs have run in, as well as the different kinds of foci that DATs have chosen. And we've purposely not aligned the departments and the changes that they've chosen to work on because we'd like to keep the identity of departments somewhat confidential because we've done research on them and published on them. So you'll see later, we'll use some pseudonyms to describe specific DATs that align with your interests from the word cloud that we collected from the Slido. And but what you can see from this table is that we've run DATs in about 15 different disciplines. They comprise many of the natural sciences, several engineering departments, as well as social science and one of our humanities departments. And they have sort of on a 50-50 basis, very roughly, invested in looking at trying to make curricular change in their departments or cultural change in their departments around community or the integration of undergraduates in the life of the department, or in improving the experiences of undergraduates or graduate students that are underrepresented in the department. So there's a really vast array of changes that DATs have been working on implementing in their departments on both the cultural and curricular side. On the curricular side, it includes establishing assessment tools and implementation plans for assessment over long periods of time, developing learning outcomes for their program, ensuring that their curriculum is coordinated across the major. Several DATs have been working on that. Making sure that the curriculum leads to undergraduate employability. So it's really quite diverse. And the DAT project was established to allow that kind of diversity and choice among DAT departments, while also ensuring a sort of consistent facilitated experience and high quality experience of having been being on a effective team for making changes. So one of our questions that came in was about how DATs and APS IDEA are different in focus, and it's true that APS IDEA is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and some DATs have focused on that work, but the DAT project in general has focused much more broadly on change in undergraduate education. So I'm going to turn it over to Gina now.
Thank you all for participating in the word cloud. I'm just going to move over the word cloud results into the screen share. You can see a lot of kinds of ideas here that came up. The really big ones, the size of them correspond to how common they were. So you see collaboration, equity, and research-based teaching were all really important for people. We also see that thinking about students and having student involvement and also student support was important, and thinking about retention and belonging was also important, and many dimensions of equity that we see here, including gender justice and accessibility. We're going to now use these results to actually guide the next few slides that we present, because we prepared a few descriptions of some of the DATs that we've worked with, but I think we're just going to focus on 3 of them. Potions, summoning, and divination are the names that we call the DATs that we'll be looking at today. So I think potions is up first with Joel.
All right, thanks. Yeah, and in case it wasn't clear, the funny names are because we want to, protect the identities of the folks we've worked with. Yeah, so the potions department, I think this is also pretty relevant to the person who asked about the distinction between DATs and APS IDEA. So the potions department, their focus was very squarely on improving the experiences for underrepresented students, undergraduate students in their department, in their major. And so, I think a point here to reiterate is that for us, we say undergraduate education in this project, but we're thinking of that in the most broad way possible. So essentially, any issue that touches on the undergraduate experience counts for us. So for this particular DAT, the membership shifted a bunch over time, but included overall 4 faculty members, all on the tenure track, I believe, 1 postdoc, 2 staff members, 3 graduate students, and 2 undergraduate students. so a pretty nice cross section, and I think they worked in a facilitated way for about 2 years, and they've been working independently for several more, 2 or 3 years perhaps, and they ended up producing a lot of really good work. 2 reports on diversity and inclusion in the department, which I think were the first of its kind. For that department. They have a monthly seminar series that they're running now on equity and inclusion issues that are pretty well attended. They worked to shift the way that the honors introductory course in that department was run to increase access to a much broader set of students, and actually to reframe it from an honors course into a majors introductory course. They helped to set up gender neutral bathrooms in their building. They set up welcome events for admitted students from underrepresented groups and did specific outreach to those groups. They have now shifted from being a DAT into a permanent departmental committee, and won a diversity award from their campus last year, which we were pretty happy to see. And we have a quote here from a faculty member from that group. So compared to a regular faculty committee, having both the undergrads and grad student perspectives about both their experiences and what they really care about has been really important for shaping what we do, and that's incredibly valuable. So I think this is really speaking to this idea that having this cross-section of people in the DAT in the DATs really adds a lot of value, because people are hearing, can hear from folks who are in different roles about their experiences, which really helps the group function a lot better and do better work.
Great. And now we will move on to the DAT that we call summoning.
Thanks, Gina. So this DAT had the sort of interesting situation of having had a graduates program for many years and a large body of research faculty. And then they were just adding, when the DAT was formed, a new undergraduate major. I think the major had been 6 months old or something when the DAT formed. And they chose as their focus their intent to engage undergraduates in the departmental community and to create community among undergraduates as well. And this DAT ended up being 2 tenure track faculty, 2 instructors, 2 graduate students, and 2 undergraduates. They were extremely balanced DAT in terms of roles. And they ended up choosing to create a number of events for undergraduates to participate in, as well as events for undergraduates and graduate students. There was welcome events, but the biggest thing that they did, and they have continued to do annually, is an industry night where they invite people from the different national labs around the area, as well as other companies, to come and collect resumes, as well as meet the students that are looking for jobs. And they also thought about the fact that, and this came also from the undergraduate students who were on the DAT, they talked extensively about what does it take to participate in an industry night and what kind of experience do you need to be successful at that. So they actually had pre-events to prepare students for the industry night, like a resume writing workshop and an interview kind of elevator speech workshop. One of the things that was notable about this DAT was the activity of the undergraduates and the amount of leadership that they took, as well as were accorded, and the ways that faculty encouraged that. There were 2 undergraduates, and they ended up leading the departmental Facebook and LinkedIn projects, as well as being integral in all of the other projects. The quote here, "I'm not sure how we will survive without our facilitators. Please do not leave us," is one of our favorites, just because this was a very candid DAT, and they were really fun to be a part of. And they did, in fact, continue on after we ended external facilitation, and they're doing just fine. I think that when they are experiencing the external facilitation, they felt like, how could we ever replicate this? But they picked up more than they may have realized just through the modeling that facilitators give. There's a little bar graph here in the corner that shows the results of an exit poll that we gave them, where it shows one answer to a question: I'm learning how to more effectively make departmental changes, and 4 out of 5 of the respondents said that they strongly agreed with that question. So I think the next person is Courtney, yes?
Yes, so I want to share with you a little bit more information about our Divination department, and their focus was on developing student learning outcomes for the purposes of collecting data about how well students were doing in the program so that they could submit it to their external accrediting body. And one of the motivators for this department in coming to the DAT project was that they had been trying to collect accreditation data for 1 or 2 years before coming to us. And when they came to us, they acknowledged that they were having a lot of trouble gaining departmental consensus. And so when I saw the word cloud, that one of the big words that popped up or themes that popped up there was collaboration. This DAT really exemplified that, because they not only had a very diverse group in that they had 2 undergraduate students, a graduate student, 3 tenure track faculty, 2 student advisors, and 1 staff member, but they also worked closely with the rest of the department and frequently shared what the DAT was doing in order to gain departmental support. So we worked extremely closely with the DAT on how to present what the DAT was doing to the department, the rest of the department, and how to gain departmental support, which was really great. And I think the quote exemplifies that when one of the DAT members said, providing those models for change, we probably never would have seen that had we not been a part of a DAT. And talking through that was also really good, because it allowed us to see how we could function as a group and then department to make that change happen. It's been good to have that space to ask someone who has that in their wheelhouse, just talking points or language, how to come up and draft that. And as a result of this DAT's work, they ended up completely overhauling their student learning outcomes and aligning those with the outcomes for the majors individual courses, and then developed a subsequent plan that was approved of by the entire department for collecting learning outcome data that can then be shared with the external accrediting body. So this was a DAT that really exemplified not only collaboration, but also working with students.
So just to summarize some of the ways that DATs have had impacts, we've seen DATs support department-wide curricular changes, such as the accreditation, things tied to accreditation efforts, also catalyzing cultural and community change, so initiatives related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as sort of other cultural features. And also we see strong evidence that DATs support the developing the change agency of DAT members, especially students. So now I think Courtney's going to discuss implementation.
Yeah, and we wanted to give you a quick overview of the first steps that you might take if you would like to implement the DAT model. And we know that implementing the DAT model or making change in your department can be a very complicated task. And so we have actually put together a number of resources to support you in making change and implementing the DAT model. And this next section, while I will go through some of the steps for implementing the DAT model, I'll also really be focusing on identifying some of the different resources that we have developed to support you in this journey. So as you can see here, we have 2 major places to access resources. And the first is our new book, Facilitating Change in Higher Education. This book walks you through step-by-step how to implement the DAT model, with a lot of information on the theory behind the DAT model, and then practical steps for facilitators on what to do in order to implement the DAT model. And this book will be available for purchase in the upcoming weeks. As part of our work with DATs, we have, before this book was really coming together, we have also developed a number of standalone resources to support facilitators in this process. And these resources are integrated throughout the book. And we have more information within the book on, how and when to implement these resources. But we are also making these resources free and available for download on our website. So you can see up at the top, we have the link to our new DAT project website. And the digital resources will be uploaded there soon as we are finished, refining them. But in the meantime, any resources that I present to you today will be available at that tiny URL link that we have, and we will make this available in the chat, and also it'll be available on the ending slide as well. So any resources that we chat about today will be available there through a Google Drive folder. So the resources that we have developed will help you think about the DAT model in different ways, and to help you know what might be necessary in order to implement the DAT model. So these are some examples of resources that we have made to help you evaluate, is the DAT model even right for your context? And to help you know what can be adapted to your specific context. We acknowledge that all departments and institutions are very different, so what might have worked at CU and CSU might not necessarily work in a different context. So we have developed resources such as innovation configuration maps, along with a how-to guide of how to use these innovation configuration maps, and that helps you distinguish what is acceptable and unacceptable variations of the DAT model. Within our book, we have a table that outlines the basic characteristics and anti-characteristics of a DAT. And this expands on what Joelle outlined earlier on what is a DAT and what might not be a DAT. We also have the core principles that Joelle alluded to, and this is a handout, which the core principles serve as a guidepost for the DAT's work and the team culture, but we have provided this in a handout form that you can pass out to a form DAT, or you can pass this out to department members at a meeting that introduces the DAT model. You can share this with relevant admin as well. And then we also have the DAT model theory of change. And this, as Joelle mentioned earlier, identifies the major ordered outcomes that must occur. And we have weaved the DAT model theory of change as well as the core principles throughout the book in order to integrate everything together for you, all of the different information that we have. And I didn't mention earlier, but these icons that are next to each of the resources identify where you can find these resources. So all of the resources are available or referenced within the book. But then when we have a book icon, that means that resource is only available within our books, such as the table that outlines the characteristics and anti-characteristics. And then the web icon means it is also available on our website, or will be available on our website. So as I mentioned, we used the theory of change throughout our book, and this is an example of part of the theory of change. And so this is what the first section, or part of the first section of our theory of change, looks like. And we have used these outcomes to organize our chapters. And so one of our first chapters talks about initiating communication with department members, chair, and relevant admin, and also taking steps to assess readiness of the department for the DAT model. And we encourage people to do this because it is possible that a department might not have the adequate resources to support a DAT in the beginning, and that's okay, because we also offer steps on how to get a department ready in order to support a DAT. Some resources that go along with communication, with initiating communication and assessing readiness, include a how-to guide on building awareness of DATs, slides that you can use that outline the DAT model or provide an overview of the DAT model. And you can use these within a departmental meeting. You can use them for your own information. And we also have a handout that talks about collaborative communities that can help you articulate the differences between the DAT and a typical department committee or another working group, such as a faculty learning community. And on the right there, you'll see I have outcome 3A. And so again, this is part of the theory of change. And this outcome is some department members are ready to participate in a DAT, and these resources can help you prepare for that outcome. And on the next slide, you'll see that the resources are the same, but we have a different outcome listed. The departmental leadership is ready for a DAT. And again, these resources will help you achieve outcome 3B. At the end of each chapter in our book, we have a section what we call indicators of success. And so this is where we provide some concrete indicators for how you can know whether or not whether or not you have achieved what that chapter, the content of that chapter. So for example, for the chapter that's about communication and readiness, we provide some indicators of evidence that a DAT is likely to be successful in your department. So this can include meaningful conversations about improving undergraduate education have occurred, and there is expressed interest from the department chair and some department members in the DAT model. We also include evidence that your department might not be ready for a DAT, where you might have noticed, based on different types of evidence, that improving undergraduate education is not a priority in the department. They might be prioritizing other topics for the department at that time. Or the department is already in the middle of a change, such as hiring a new department chair, and the department might not be prepared to support a DAT at that time. So another chapter that we have in the book, and another step that you would take in order to implement a DAT, is to prepare as an external facilitator. So as you can see here, we have an outcome in our theory of change for facilitators are ready to run a DAT. And we have different outcomes, sub-outcomes within this outcome related to facilitator preparation. We have a number of resources related to preparing to facilitate DATs. And the first is an entire chapter dedicated to what you need to do to prepare to facilitate DATs. We have a how-to guide on how to document and reflect on meetings that you have with DATs, and a how-to guide related to using DAT member input. Because the DAT model is extremely collaborative, we use DAT member input frequently, and this how-to guide outlines different ways to collect and use DAT member input for improving meetings or for determining the vision or the focus of the DAT. And finally, throughout the entire book, we have little sections that are what we call DATs in real life. And so this is where we provide examples of the DATs that we have facilitated in the past several years of the project that are relevant to the content of that chapter. And we outline what facilitators, the context of the DAT, and then how facilitators might have responded to a particular challenge that DAT was experiencing. And again, much like the other chapter, we have indicators of success for the facilitator readiness chapter as well, which can include involvement in a facilitator community, a self-assessment of facilitation skills, and sufficient understanding of the departmental needs and context. So these were just a few of the steps that you might need to take in order to form, or that we recommend that you take in order to form a DAT. And we outline them, as I said, in more detail in our book, and also provide those resources that a lot of those resources that are necessary to help you form a DAT on our website as well as in the book.
And now we have our second block of time for Q&A. I think I want to address a question that actually came up in the first chunk of time, but I thought that it would be easier to answer now, because somebody asked about what kinds of data we've been collecting and what kinds of analysis have been happening. And so I just wanted to briefly speak to this, although I feel like this could have been also a webinar in and of itself. But we have conducted active research on the DAT project, and there's been a lot of kinds of things that we've studied, trying to understand the effectiveness of DATs themselves. So for example, one active area of research is trying to understand how the core principles support DATs in making changes, and to what extent those are being implemented in DATs. We've also tried to understand sustainability. So what does it take for these changes to be sustained? And also questions around how can we measure to what extent departmental culture changes. And so for all of these, we've collected a wide range of data sources. Analyzing meeting notes and among DATs and also facilitator reflections has been really productive. We've also collected interviews with DAT members, and we've developed a survey related to departmental culture, which is something that we use to track changes. All right, and so another question that came up in the chat is, what is the role of the dean in these? And maybe I'll pose that to Sarah. Do you want to take that one?
Sure. So among the DATs that we've facilitated, the deans have not had a super strong direct role, though Courtney may want to speak to this from the CSU campus. Where they have had a role is in our ongoing efforts to secure funding for a DAT program on campus that's more permanent. And so, for example, we've received funding from 2 different colleges at CU Boulder to support some facilitator salary when we were looking at a funding gap. Courtney, would you like to jump in on any other administrator roles that have affected your DATs?
Sure. I would also agree with Sarah in that, at CSU, the deans have not had a super large role. We have worked primarily with department chairs directly, and then we have also worked closely with student affairs staff as well, who have been super informative and helpful in implementing DATs and identifying the type of foci that DATs might focus on. In addition, we've actually had some student affairs staff participate on certain DATs depending on their interest and depending on the foci of the DATs.
Great. Let's see. I think there's also questions about how this connects to the broader sea change effort. I wonder, does anyone else want to take on that question?
I can do that. So I'm seeing a question about if people are participating in sea change, will your group provide facilitators? So we've written the book and created resources so that people can develop facilitation resources internally. The funding that we had from NSF to provide external facilitation was only for the campuses that we've run the DATs on so far. We don't have like nationwide funding as much as we would love to have that. We've had some success, like I said before, gaining sponsorship from colleges. And we're hoping to see that university campuses will be able to find facilitation resources through their teaching and learning centers or other kinds of resources that they may have available. But that said, developing internal facilitation resources using the resources that we are providing, we think is very possible. We're just on the cusp of doing this, and we are piloting an effort to support internal facilitators at our 2 campuses currently to sort of play around with the idea of how do you help facilitation resources sort of gain capacity in a university. We're not there yet for supporting people broadly. The idea that faculty from other departments could provide facilitation is something that's come up among our project that we haven't actually implemented before. But the idea that departments could switch facilitation resources, so one department provide an outside facilitator to a different department and vice versa, is something that we think is pretty viable and could be pretty beneficial. And we would love to know if people are doing that kind of experiment.
Great. And I think we have time for more questions, but I wanted to just throw up the last slide and invite you all. We would love to hear from you. And so if you have further questions, or if we don't get to your question, because I can see that we have way more questions than we have time for, you are encouraged to contact us through a contact form that we'll post in the chat. And I also wanted to just remind folks of the link to all of the resources that Courtney mentioned in her section can be found at this tiny URL. All right, let's get back to Q&A. So I see a really good question around what about doing DATs in the time of COVID, and how do you run DATs when faculty burnout is so common? And maybe one of the folks who's currently facilitating or is currently seeing DATs work through this pandemic, could one of you chime in?
I'll go. I would say that for the DATs that we've been facilitating, we didn't start any new DATs very for whatever reason, very close to when the pandemic and all of that really started to get bad. And so, which is to say that the DATs that we've been running have been, we've been facilitating them for about a year or so. So the transition to online went fairly smoothly. But I think that was largely because we'd already built relationships with these folks. We'd already spent a lot of time working together. So that went okay, and people were able, for the most part, to transition to online. Of course, everybody's schedules are upside down. The situation makes it is more difficult now, of course, but that I think went smoothly. I think if we were trying to start a DAT in COVID time, that would be a much more challenging thing.
Great. Thanks, Joel. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Ooh, this feels like a lot of pressure to pick one. How about this question of how might we transform an existing departmental committee into a DAT? Because I think we actually haven't thought that much about this question. Does anyone want to take a stab at this?
I can do that. So we have had this question come up recently because a number of departments have been interested in creating new education, diversity, and inclusion kinds of groups on campus. I'd say in this case, you're talking about a group that already has staff, tenure track, and non-tenure track faculty. And the first thing I think I would work on is talking with the departmental staff and faculty about adding students to such a group. And then you say that external facilitation seems to be a major difference, but how would you go about finding a facilitator? And I would talk among the people already on the group who may be interested in developing facilitation skills and using our resources to do so. There's a whole chapter on becoming a facilitator in our book. And I think that that could seem a little daunting, but if you think about taking on a facilitator role separately from being a participant and really sort of trying to step outside the role of guiding exactly what the group does and instead being more of a guider of the group itself, it is actually a really enjoyable role. I've loved this job that I've had for the last 4 years because it's so different and it has just a different effect on things. It's not as much of a direct control, but it is certainly impactful. So I'd recommend you try.
Well, thank you. I want to be mindful of time. Thank you, especially to the DAT team for showing up and telling us all about these things. Thank you for the great questions. I know we didn't get through all of them. Again, this is for the Physics and Astronomy Sea Change project. We think that, DATs are a pathway forward to participate in our pilot and complete the self-assessment. If you have any questions regarding DATs, you know how to reach them. I also will be sending an email out after the webinar has been uploaded to YouTube. AAPT has its own YouTube channel. So if you have any questions about the Physics and Astronomy Sea Change project, I'd be happy to answer them. In the meantime, I hope everyone has great weeks, and we'll stop recording right now. Thank you again, everybody, for participating.
Thanks, Alexis.